The readings this weekend give us an insight into God and into His church. And so I want to talk about three sort of facts about the church, two sort of what facts and one how. So the first what is the church? The church is this institution established by Jesus Christ Himself to continue the work that He began when He was on earth. And so Jesus guides the church. It's the first what about the church. That Jesus is the one who established it, and because He established it, He guides it along its way through time. And we hear this in the gospel in some sense. So the boat, the apostles are out on the water, and Jesus goes up to the mountain to pray. Right? It's not that He was tired of the apostles. Right? It's not that He was sort of distancing Himself from them. He was still with them, just in a different way. Right? He was up on the mountain praying, and we can assume that He was praying for them. Right, that He was watching over them. He was on the mountain up high. They are on the water. And so we can think about Him watching over them, making sure that they are safe on their journey. And the same thing is true of the church. In fact, over the centuries, the church has been called the bark of Peter, or the boat of Peter. And so the church can be seen in that boat with the apostles on the water. Sometimes the water is nice and sailing is easy. Sometimes it's not. Right? Sometimes it's difficult, and sometimes we in the church are afraid. Right? Because we notice what is going on around us. But we have to remember that Jesus is on the mountain praying for us. Right? Jesus is in heaven interceding for us, praying for us to God the Father. And so that's the first thing, that Jesus guides His church. And so if Jesus guides the church, it's not just in sort of a general sense, right, or a collective sense. Yes, He guides the entire church, but He also guides each individual member of the church. Right? We as baptized people make up the church. And so Jesus guides us too. And if Jesus guides us, that means that if we leave the church, we run into trouble. Right? Not like the police are going to come and catch you, but personally, right? We run into trouble. We experience difficulties. And so that's the second point, that we need to remain in the boat, right? In the church, if we want to be guided. And this is depicted beautifully in Rome at St. Peter's Basilica. So as you're walking out of St. Peter's Basilica, if you're walking out the back door, you would look up and see a mosaic of this scene from the Gospel. Right? The 11 apostles safely in the boat, and St. Peter out on the water falling, with Jesus reaching out to grab his hand so that he doesn't sink. And I think that gives us some way to interpret this gospel passage, right? I think somewhat traditional interpretation is that Peter began to sink because he doubted Christ and took his eyes off of him when he was out of the boat. And I think that that's obviously a valid interpretation. It has some spiritual message for us, but I want to focus on a little bit different interpretation. So I want to focus more so on how Peter doubted Christ. Right? Usually we think he was already out of the boat and he took his eyes off of Jesus, and that's when he doubted. I think that's true, but I think he also could have doubted Jesus before he even left the boat. Because how does he ask Jesus to let him walk on water? Can't say that without thinking of Eddie Money, right? But how did he think to ask Jesus to walk on water? He said, "Lord, if it is you, then command me to walk on the water." He didn't believe that it was him at the outset. And so his doubt, not knowing if it was Jesus, is what caused him to get out of the boat. And I think that's true for us a lot of times in our own life, if we're thinking of the church as the boat. that we run into some difficult situation, Jesus is veiled from our eyes, and we begin to doubt. And so we leave the boat. Right? We all know someone who's doubted a teaching of the church, or who has come across some very difficult moment in their life, and because of that, they left the church. Right? They got out of the boat. And if we do that, then we are going to sink like St. Peter. Right? We run into all kinds of problems if we leave the bark of Peter. And I think of my professor for church history whenever I was writing this. So this was a very rough and gruff man. He was from New York, kind of had that sort of hard exterior as a New Yorker would have. He was a Dominican, and so he had a white habit, but it was never really white. You could tell he used it to wipe the chalk off the board, or used it to wipe his hands at the meal. It was always kind of nasty. He's a very rough man. And when we were talking about the period of the Protestant Reformation, he was talking about all of the things that happened whenever people started to leave the church, right, and establish their own other churches. And his words were this, that you can't unhook yourself from the bark of Peter and not expect to go adrift. Right? If we leave the boat, if we leave the church, then we open ourselves up to all kinds of difficulties and struggles and other temptations. And so we have to stay in the boat. We have to stay in the church and trust in Jesus. So those are the two sort of factual things about the church, right? That Jesus guided it because he established it, and that we have to remain in the church, and if we don't, we run into problems. So if Jesus guides his church, how does he do it? Right? How does he guide the church as a whole, and how does he guide each of us individually that are members of that church? Well, I think we get this from the first reading. So in the first reading we hear from the prophet Elijah, the first book of Kings, and it's a story about the prophet Elijah who comes to this cave. Right? He's by himself, and he experiences God, but he does it in a somewhat unusual way based on how he expected to experience God and how we expect to experience God. Right? We expect God a lot of times to be very forceful, to be very obvious and flashy. Right? We want to see him in this strong and heavy wind that rends the mountains, that crushes rocks. We want to see God in an earthquake, right? Very visible, very strong. We want to see God in a fire, something very obvious to us. But that is not how God works, right? How does Elijah experience the Lord? After the fire, there was a tiny whispering sound. And when he heard this, Elijah hid his face in his cloak and went and stood at the entrance of the cave. Elijah experienced the Lord in a tiny whispering sound. And that is how God is going to guide us in the church. He's not going to, take out a billboard. He's not Gordon or any of those other attorneys, right, that buys up every billboard along the interstate. He's not going to do that and sort of advertise himself to us in that way. Father Broussard, you need to do this. No. It's going to be a tiny whispering sound. And it's going to be through the means that he set up to guide us, right, through the church. And so that tiny whispering sound in the church is our daily prayer. I think I've mentioned to you before, right, that when I sit in the chapel, it's not revelation after revelation of, God showing his face to me, or God appearing, or the Blessed Virgin saying, Father Broussard, you need to do this, you need to stop doing that, No. It's a tiny whispering sound. Right? It's a getting to know him so that I can be guided interiorly by his promptings. And so it's in our daily prayer, in that quiet whispering, that God is going to guide us. It's in the tiny whispering sound of coming to Mass every week that God is going to guide us, of receiving the sacraments. Right? Christ established the church. Christ instituted the sacraments. And so that is how he wants to guide us. And it's difficult that that is the way that he chooses, because a lot of times we want a direct answer. Right? This past week, I would have loved to have gone to check the mail and saw a note from God saying you should either open or not open the school on time. That's not how God works. And so what did I do? I prayed, I talked to other people that I trusted, and I made a decision. And I trust that it's the right decision. I trust that God is guiding me in that. Even though he didn't give me a sign, right? He's guiding me by that tiny whispering sound. And Christ also whispers to us through the priesthood. Right? Just like Christ instituted the church, he instituted the priesthood. And I thought of this because I thought of the many times that someone has come talk to me with an issue in their lives, and they leave and they say, "Father, I feel so much better having come talk to you." And I sit there and wonder why, because I didn't really do anything. A lot of times I don't even say anything, except for, I'm not really sure. But that is enough to be the tiny whispering sound that God uses to guide someone in a critical moment in their lives. And so I've said it before, I'll say it again, bother me. And don't start off with, "Father, I know you're busy." It doesn't matter, right? Come talk to us. If you have some crisis, if you are struggling, come talk to me and Father Rosa. Come talk to both of us. Right? We want to be there for you because that is the way that Christ has established for you to be guided by that tiny whispering voice. And so today, hopefully, we are encouraged to renew our faith in Christ and in his church that he has established. Right? That church that he established, that guides us. That church that continuously is watched over and led by Christ. And that church that is the means by which he does guide us with that tiny whispering voice. Right? Through the ordinary ministry of the church. Through the boring things of the church. Right? Prayer, sacraments, the priesthood. Right? That he is with us and that he guides us in those difficult moments in our lives.